So my last video on speed limit reductions generated a lot of debate. I only had one comment supporting the speed limits, everyone else was against it, and that included quite a few people like frontline police officers and urban planners and engineers who'd been involved in road safety as well. So I was quite overwhelmed by that support, and it's clear the community does not understand the need for these reductions. What we're going to look at today is how safe do we actually want to be. So let's start by saying that nobody wants a road death or injury, and we need to work to minimise the amount of fatal and serious injuries we get on our road. Anytime there is one, it's beyond traumatic. Not only is the immediate friends and family deeply affected, traumatised, but beyond that, then you've got wider friends, acquaintances, co-workers, etc., the first responders, the people that have to deal with the aftermath administration of it. It's a massive human emotional toll. And then on top of that, we've also got the physical cost to society. It costs money every time someone dies on the road, or even when they don't die on the road, when there's an accident or crash. So we want to minimise that. But here's the thing, right? We can't realistically ever get it to zero. We can't do that. We can aim towards it, but to say that we're going to get to zero, I think just ignores human nature and the reality of any type of world of law. We also get the law of diminishing returns, and what that means is that the first 80% of anything maybe takes 20% of the effort, and the last 20% of that takes 80%. So the more effort we put into it, the better we'll be, but the percentage increases get less. And then you've got to look at it and say, okay, well, if I'm going to try and overall reduce trauma to society, is spending more dollars on roads the best way to do it, or do we do it somewhere in healthcare or domestic violence or somewhere like that? Those are really big pictures outside of my scope. So the question is, what compromises then do we as a society want to make in return for safer and safer roads? Because we can't have something for nothing. Now here's the thing, right? Humans do not prioritise safety over all else. Nothing in our psyche and our behaviour indicates that. So here's some examples. So active risk taking: we jaywalk, we ignore pedestrian crossings, we rush out in front of cars, and we do that willingly. It puts our lives at risk, yet we do it anyway. We take up dangerous hobbies, things like abseiling, car racing, scuba diving, flying. You know, if you want to look at a life insurance policy, the exclusions on that, to my mind and many other people's minds, reads like a list of fun things to do with your life. Yet we actively seek that risk. And then when we're doing stuff around the home, we often don't use ladders properly or safely. We don't take all the precautions with power tools. We don't wear PPE on chainsaws. All of these things that we just almost deliberately take risks. And then by inactivity, things we don't do, but we could. And not many people exercise really well or eat really well. Every time you've got a sugary drink, you know, that's not good for your overall lifespan, yet we do it anyway. We don't get regular medical checkups. We probably take more care of our car than we do ourselves. Again, it's another inactivity thing. And we don't fix things like trip hazards and potential things where we could trip over. So humans have this tolerance for risk, and I think that needs to be brought in to any road safety discussion and go, okay, let's work with human nature, not against it. Now, here's the thing. If you had a choice, right? So you could drive everywhere for the rest of your life at 30 kilometers an hour, and you'd have, let's say, a 1 in 80,000 chance of dying. Or you could say you can drive at the current speed limits and you're going to take a 1 in 20,000 chance. Which would you choose? Now, if you're going to maximise safety, you'd say, I'm going to drive everywhere at 30 k's an hour. But and I think a lot of other people would say, you know what, it's a very tiny risk, and a tiny risk multiplied by 2 or 3 is still a tiny risk. I want to enjoy life, so I'm going to go with the higher speed and make that trade-off. And if that's what people want, if that's what society as a whole says, then the rule makers and the people in authority need to listen to that. Now, I'm not saying this is the case. I'm saying it needs to be considered. I don't know what the public would say. I know what I would say, but I'm not the public. I'm interested in what you guys would say as well. So here's the question, the balance between risk of death and convenience, because frankly there is one, as we're going to cover later on. So I've got some stats from the motor vehicle survey use run by the Australian Bureau of Statistics. The last time it was run a few years ago, and here's what they say. We've got around 20 million motor vehicles in Australia, and they're averaging 12,000 kilometres each, and that gives us around about 239 million kilometres driven per year. In 2018, before COVID screwed all the stats up, we had about 1135 road deaths, going up to 1,300 in 2024. For the purposes of this, I'm going to round it up to a nice easy 1,400. So that means we've got one death per 170 million kilometres driven. Remember, that's averaged out, and you can do a lot to reduce your chances, as we'll see in a moment. So if you drive 25,000 kilometres a year, or you're in a vehicle for 25 kilometres a year for 60 years, that's 1.5 million kilometres. And that's going to be 114 lifetimes before you cover that sort of distance. So essentially then the chances of dying on the road are very, very small. Not zero, and we should seek to reduce them further, but at what point do we run into that law of diminishing returns, and at what point are we better off spending the money somewhere else, and at what point do we go, that's safe enough, I'm just beyond that, it's starting to get into my inconvenience. So that is the question we're dealing with here. Now, here's some ways to lower the risk even further. Number one, don't drink and drive. You do that and your risk of dying or having a crash massively shoots up. Number two, don't drive tired. Fatigue, huge risk. Number three, don't road rage. Aggression, that would almost certainly get you into trouble and certainly increase the chances of an incident. Wearing a seatbelt. People not wearing seatbelts are hugely overrepresented in crashes, and in my previous video I noted that the USA had a very high crash rate or fatality rate, and one of the reasons why turns out to be that a lot of them don't wear seatbelts because they view it as an infringement of their rights. So wearing a seatbelt, it's a good thing to do, and take a low risk driving course, which can massively lower your chances of crashing, certainly dying. And here's some other ways we could make travel super safe. One is we could redesign all the cars. Instead of being 5 and 4 and 7 seats, they've just got 3 seats down the middle. Then we've got this massive crash structure around us. That would certainly make us safe. We could mandate for that. We could put race type tyres on all cars, ones that work on the wet and the dry. They're expensive, they don't last long, but if they're grippier then you can stop more quickly should you need to, and we can optimise the tyres for stopping. And yes, they'll cost more, they'll be noisier, etc., but you know, that would be safer. We could have 6-month inspections for every vehicle to ensure that the tyres, the brakes, everything else is up to speed, including all of the active safety gear. We could wear full race gear for every journey, including a helmet like this and a head and neck restraint device like that, and even fireproof gloves like this, and fireproof underwear, which I'm not going to demonstrate or even tell you whether I'm wearing or not. Now, we could reduce speed limits to only 30 kilometres an hour. That would definitely reduce all of the crashes, but again, what sort of compromise do we want to make? And we could also train all drivers, and I'm talking post-licence, low-risk driver training here, not cones or just the normal driver training. And we could also mandate first aid kits to be carried and training as to how to use them, which is in fact the case in some countries, such as some in Europe. So how effective is driver training? Well, I have some statistics here. There are many corporates out there who actually pay companies to come in and train their staff how to drive, which is kind of odd if you think about it, because the staff are already qualified to drive, yet they're being trained again to do it. And sometimes that's due to regulatory compliance, but other times it simply makes financial sense for the company to invest training in its drivers to reduce the crash rate, because a lot of large corporates are self-insured, and anytime there's a crash, then that means the vehicle's got to be repaired, there's got to be an incident form that's got to be filled out, whatever job that vehicle was doing now can't be done, another vehicle needs to go and do it. it's just a lot of grief. So how effective is it? Well, I'm going to put some stats up. You can read them for yourself, and if we average them out, it comes to around about 72% reduction in incident rates, which is massive. That's way beyond what a speed limit reduction could do, for example. So how is that done? Well, the answer is it's not about giving people car control skills, it's about attitude and observation. That's the key to this training, and it really does work. Otherwise, those corporates wouldn't actually be investing that money voluntarily to do so. And even if we call it 50%, not 72%, that's massive. Now I want to talk about statistics, and the government has put out one saying that you're 11 times more likely to be killed on a regional or remote road than you are in the city. Okay, let's unpack that a bit. First of all, it's not 11 times more is the issue, it's how likely you are in total. This is something I've never bought before. It is a lottery ticket, and I didn't win. If I had won on Division 1, I actually still would be making this video because I enjoy what I do and I think it's important, but nevertheless, I didn't win. Now, that is one ticket. If I'd have bought 11 tickets or 12 tickets or 20 tickets, then I would have 10 or 11 times more chance of winning the lottery. But here's the thing. If you've got a tiny chance, multiplying that by 10 is still a tiny chance. So I might go and buy 100 lottery tickets, I'm still not going to win. And similarly, if you've got a tiny chance of being killed on the roads, if that's 11 times higher, it's still tiny. And as humans, we tend to accept a certain amount of risk inherent in what we do, just in order to be able to go and live our lives normally. So here's an example where I can twist the stats the other way. The TAC in Victoria has statistics on their website, and I went to get some. This wasn't the first one I looked up to see how many people lived in Melbourne, city areas versus regional. The answer is 5.4 million versus 1.7. Now this is from the TAC. So since 2000, 13,000 pedestrians have been killed or hospitalised in Melbourne, 2788 in regional areas. So if we look at that on a per 100,000 population basis, what we find is that we've got a 50% chance higher of being killed or hospitalised as a pedestrian in urban areas compared to rural areas. And I don't need to explain to you why that statistics is meaningless. It's exactly the same as that. It's a different area. You're not comparing like with likes, and you're just coming up with this 11x figure because it sounds awful, and you're not explaining that the risk actually itself to begin with is microscopic. So what do you guys think the problem is? I read loads of comments, I put a poll on my YouTube. Here's what you said. Your top one was distracted drivers, and I agree with that. I think a big cause of distraction is twofold. Cars are easier to drive than ever. We've got automatic gearbox, we've got self-centering lane keep assist systems, we've got autonomous emergency braking. They are very easy to drive, and that means there's not a lot to do. You're not in that situation where you've got a good level of stress. You're in a low level of stress situation. And the things which you have to do are often now on touchscreens, and touchscreens are deadly. I call them look screens, and the problem is that often the control is buried 2 or 3 deep, which is bad enough, but you've actually got to look at the screen. You can't operate a touchscreen by touch, ironically enough. You can operate a lever, a dial or a button by touch, you can't on a touchscreen. And often those icons and things you've got to touch are quite small. They're not easy to operate. And I think ANCAP really need to get into safety ergonomics as opposed to just ergonomics and sort this problem out. The next one was really interesting, hadn't occurred to me, societal anger post-COVID. So the theory goes that in COVID, we were in a pandemic, which is historically quite common, but for everyone it was the first time we'd really had one in our lives. And there was a lot of stress. People were losing their businesses, they were losing loved ones, we couldn't go out, many restrictions, we didn't know what was happening. It was a really stressful time, and that stress seemed to manifest itself as anger and aggression. So we all started fighting over toilet paper, and that sort of set a new baseline for rudeness and aggression in society, and that has kept with us to this present day. And now we see even Bunnings, their staff potentially might wear body cams, and lots of retail establishments have signs saying, please don't stab our staff. And we didn't used to see that a few years ago. Now that surely has to come out onto the road. I don't have any stats, but I think that the theory is definitely worth looking into. Road maintenance, a lot of you pick road maintenance as an issue. I agree with that to some extent. I think a good driver can compensate for a lot of that, and if you go over a pothole, yes, that's going to damage your car potentially, but is it actually going to cause an accident? Yes, but I don't think that's right up there. Immigrants, that is a touchy one. So here's the deal. The topmost immigrant country to Australia is the UK, after that India, then China. Now, depending on which country you come over to Australia, you have to do different things to get an Australian driving licence. And you can go to, for example, the VicRoads website, you punch in the country you're coming from, how long you had a licence, and it tells you if you need to pass the theory test or the practical, or in fact both. Now, for India and China, in every single case, you need to do both theory and practical, then you can get a licence. So you're not just getting it automatically changed over. That said, the Australian driving test is extremely easy to pass, and basically driving instructors, most of them just focus on passing the test. So I think that should be tightened up for everybody, not just immigrant drivers. We then come to what I believe to be a fact. I've lived and worked in several different countries and driven in many, many more. And every country has its own specific driving culture and ways of doing things. And if you learn to drive in one country, you go to a different country, you need to readapt to how that country does things. And this is a generic statement, nothing to do with immigrants to Australia. It could be Australians going somewhere else. So for example, if Australians go to drive in Europe on freeways, they're now dealing with speeds of 130, 150 kilometers an hour faster. And then you do not sit in the fast lane. You have to move over. If someone's flashing their lights behind you or indicating, you move over, they get through, you come, and you know, that's a new way of doing it. And I've seen Australian drivers struggle with that because they're not used to that sort of driving culture and how things are done in Europe. And in the same way, having talked to some colleagues in India, Indian drivers have a way of doing things, that's their culture, it works for their country, it doesn't necessarily work over here. They've got to learn new ways of doing things. And I think if we're going to get a lot of people coming from country A to country B, and it doesn't matter which direction it is, and the driving cultures are different, then you need to do something about that and say, hey, here's what typically happens in your country, in this country, this is typically what happens, and then train accordingly. And the Australian driving test simply does not account for that at all. You just drive around the suburbs for half an hour, do a parallel park, and call it good. And finally, lack of car control. This is one I fundamentally disagree with. This is the concept of, oh yeah, you've got to be able to control the skid, etc. Absolutely not. That's not ever really been true, and it's certainly not true now in this day of ESC and ABS and modern cars. The thing is, if you get the car into a situation, a modern car into a situation where you need advanced car control skills, you are probably going to crash anyway. You don't, on a racetrack, you've got lots of room to recover a car. On a public road, you do not have the room to recover a car, and you shouldn't be in that situation in the first place. So you've got to teach people to avoid that situation. And yeah, you can take them out for a day, you can get them to drive around cones, and maybe for 5 seconds at the end of the day they can hold a drift or whatever, whoopee-doo. Are they able to do that in a different car 2 years down the track when they need it? No. So realistically, it's a perishable skill. You've got to teach people to observe, read the road, and then come back and drive properly using that observation skill. And those low-risk drivers that I mentioned earlier on, the corporates that pay for people to get their staff trained, that's what they do. They're not out there doing high-speed racetrack work. They're focusing on road, and it's all an attitude adjustment. And for proof, let me ask you this. Imagine how safe people would drive if there was a marked police car right behind you. You do tend to safeten up at that point. So that's what I've got to say. What do you guys think? How do we fix the road toll? How far do we need to go with it? What's that compromise between safety and convenience? Let me know in the comments.